Okay, I'd like to talk about starting a new file, and I'd like to go over some things that I think a lot of people know, but don't really utilize to the best of the ability that's possible. If I click start a new game, you'll see it brings up a number of different options for my game mode. The one that I'm concerned about today is the career mode. There are other options. I'm not going to talk about them. I don't really play any of the other options, to be honest with you, apart from the online. When we click new career game, it brings up this screen here. And it's telling me here that I have selected a custom database. Now this screen here, this sort of splash screen that comes up, you'll notice there's a radial button in the top right under that database. What this does is it shows you a collection of any extra data files, particularly databases, that you have subscribed to on Steam or have downloaded and deposited into the correct root folder. You can see here that I've got 4 custom files here with only one of them running. My advice personally would be only to ever run one custom file at a time. If you begin to run 2 or 3 or 4 custom files from separate creators, you will find that as the game progresses, you're probably going to see a lot more bugs, a lot more conflicts, because none of these files are official after all, and the game's trying to resolve the changes they've made to the database with the database itself. And each one of these custom files might have sort of contradictory changes within it. Basically what that means is you have more chance of coming across any number of the errors or the bugs that exist in Football Manager. The 2 common ones, of course, are graphical bugs, where the game will just experience a serious error, close, and ask you to send a bug report to Sports Interactive. Or you will get things like news items which begin to say person #%1 instead of the player's name. And obviously as the file gets longer and longer and longer, the instances that you see of these sort of bugs are going to multiply and multiply and multiply. So personally I would only ever recommend using one custom file on top of the original database. What you'll also notice here is that one of these custom files, this Faroe Islands custom file here, it has a little radial icon which is a triangle with an exclamation mark in the middle. What that means is that this database hasn't been verified in the editor by the creator, so it's probably unstable. Moreover, it isn't actually compatible with the 24.3.0 updated database because it wasn't made using the 24.3.0 updated database. If, however, I change it to the original Football Manager 2024 database, you'll see that that little symbol, that little caution symbol disappears because it's been verified within the original database. So always make sure when you download a custom database that you're using the correct sort of root database that it was compiled from, that it was built from to begin with. I see a lot of comments on Facebook, on YouTube, across the web, saying, my custom database isn't working, what am I doing wrong? 9 times out of 10, it's this simple. People just haven't changed this original database for the correct one. So I'm going to select the 24.3 update because that allows me to have this March 2025 transfer update. You don't have to use these things, and as I say, the more that you use, the more instability you will find within that save file itself. So after we select our database, it asks us to choose a game mode. Now there's 3 different modes: original, real world, your world. There's been a lot said about these since the release of the game, so I'm not gonna flog a dead horse. All I'll say is that they do provide 3 different experiences until the second season starts, and then they're all the same file anyway as the game progresses organically, so it doesn't really matter. It's more about the situation you wish to start at with your club, whether you want transfer funds or whether you want every player your club owns to be there from the beginning of the game. I'm going to choose original just because I don't really care that much. So the next thing that it gives us is the advanced setup screen, and really this is where all the power is. And there's a few really cool things that we can do here that I want to talk about. I'm going to start with setting up a file and just going over some of the bases, and then I'm going to talk about something that actually can be a great help if you know where you want to manage. So when it loads up, you can see that it's going to give us the opportunity to add or remove leagues, first of all. And this is great, and it gives us a few options. We can have leagues set as being playable, or we can have leagues being set as view only, or we can have a hybridized form of the two. And there are differences between playable and view only. So right now you can see that we have a large database set. It gives us 39,790 players, which is actually quite a low number of players. And we have 5 leagues, 5 countries selected. Okay. Now, say I plan on playing in England, but I never plan on managing in Brazil. So what I can do is I can knock Brazil into view only, and you can see that affects the amount of players that are in my database, as well as improving the speed of the game. Brazil is still there. I can still look at it within my game. It will still generate results and fixtures. The table is something that I can explore. But the detail, if I look at Internacional versus Santos and they draw 4-4, the difference between view only and playable is that I won't be able to see any of the stats or any of the details from that particular fixture. The reason for that is that when we have leagues set as playable, every fixture and every result is decided by a simulation, an engine simulation. But when we set leagues to view only, the results aren't simulated, they're done through almost like a comparison between the two teams. The reputation of the two teams and the managers and the players, the form that they're in, their attribute values. It's much more like hitting the Insta result button than it is using the engine to decide what happens. So that's the big difference between these two things. Another question that gets asked a lot about view-only leagues is about transfers and regens. So clubs will still be active in the transfer market if you set a league to view only, but it will be less active than a league that is set to playable. As far as regens are concerned, the same system is in play whether a league is view only or whether a league is playable. So teams in leagues that are set to view only will still produce their regens. The only difference is going to be that because results are not decided in the same way as they are in a playable league, while it won't affect the quality of the regens produced, you might find that they don't develop after they've been produced quite as strongly in a view-only league, because it's much more based around the player's reputation, the club's reputation, rather than being a simulation. So the other option that we have here, and I'll choose Germany for this, is that we can have playable and view only below. So what that means is I can choose to manage in the Bundesliga, for example, and have the third league and above set as view only. So it's in my game to keep that immersion there, but I never plan on managing there. So I can set it to view only, which will help my game to run a little bit quicker and a little bit smoother. So using a combination of these things, what we can actually do is we can take a game that would have been quite hefty on our processor, on our computer, that once we get to that youth intake day in March, really is going to slow down because we've got 5 leagues with 20 teams each populating these youth players, and we can sort of lessen the impact of that degradation in the speed that the file runs by utilizing this view only option. So the next thing that I want to talk about here is over on the right hand side. You can see it says approximate player count. Then if we click there, it gives us 3 database options and advanced. I would always recommend using advanced, and I would always recommend using a small database. Now, the reason for that is because you have so much control over the extra players that you bring into a database that a large database is often just populating your games with players that you're never going to sign. And there's so many files that I've played and seen played in the past where people will load up with 400,000 players and then, take over as the manager of Ayr United or Doncaster Rovers. And the point I'm making here is that of those 400,000 players that you've just loaded into your game, less than 10% of that are going to be viable transfers for you. So your database is loaded with all these players that just are never going to figure in your game. They're never going to be viable targets, and that's just going to slow you down. So maybe it's better to set your game up in such a way that you only have 100,000 players, but most of that 100,000 represent targets that viably could be signings to you. And the way to do that would be to come into this custom setup and to then identify sort of where you're likely to be able to sign players from. So a good thing to know in terms of that is maybe the reputation of the league in which you want to manage, and just on another file to have a look at the league rankings within Europe or within the world, and to find out which of the leagues are in a similar sort of reputation to your own. So if your league is ranked 64th in Europe, maybe I would be paying particular attention to anything underneath that 64th rank. And then I would come into the custom databases. I would come into maybe nations, might be the best way to do that. I would find those nations. So for example, let's just take the Faroe Islands. If I was managing in the Scottish First Division, it's probably very, very likely that the Faroe Islands is a lower reputation league, and that I will be able to sign players from the Faroe Islands to come into my club. And so it's probably more advantageous to me to select certain leagues and certain nations in this custom setup screen that allow me access to a bigger pool of viable transfers than to just throw as many players as I can into the database that I'm never going to look at, I'm never going to sign, and ultimately are going to slow down my save much quicker than I perhaps would like for it to be. So you have a whole host of options in here. You can load divisions, you can select a country. Again, I could come into the Faroe Islands here and you can see there's 4 leagues in the Faroe Islands. If I select it by divisions, I can then simply tick any of the leagues I want active. I can then come into the Faroe Islands and load any players of nationality that might be playing abroad. I can make sure that I have the current Faroese international teams all set up, as well as any players from clubs that might be competing in continental competitions. And you can see just by doing that, we've just added another sort of 5,000 players to our database, which actually is quite a lot, all of them from the Faroe Islands. And I haven't touched any of the leagues or the setup that I'm playing. And by adding that sort of 5,000 players, we have not really affected the estimated game speed. So I finally want to talk about this game speed because you may have seen people saying that it's a load of lies, it's wrong. And that used to be correct. If you're playing Football Manager 16, 17, that star rating for the estimated game speed is likely fictional. It's likely very wrong. For FM25, however, I have noticed, I have felt personally, I have no information to back this up, I do feel that game speed rating, the star rating it's giving us there, is actually much more accurate. And if the game says that you're running on 4 stars, it's going to run very fast. It's worth noting that a 2-star rating is still the game running fast on your computer. 2 stars isn't a low rating. That's still a very playable game that you should be able to expect 15 or 16 seasons out of before you notice any real drop in performance. Okay, the final things that we can do here is change the game start date from any of the countries that we have there. Not really something that I think a lot of people do, but if there's a whole number of reasons you might want to start the game at the first matches of the Europa Conference League, for example. It might be that your whole file is organised around, a narrative sort of story that you've got about some Scottish side or German side in the Europa League, and you just want to get straight to that first fixture to get everything started. But the second thing about this is that you can also use it as a tool for immersion, for example. So maybe you want to start unemployed. So you come to these advanced options at the bottom and you prevent control of teams with managers already in place, and you disable first window transfer activity. Those options there that you can see, those 4 options that I've ticked, they would actually be really suitable for a real world save where players are going to move on the date that they actually did in reality, because all of those signings are already arranged, and of course the game is starting a season in the past anyway. So this just allows you to have that element of immersion and realism within that first season, before the game starts to progress organically and teams start to make their own signings and do their own thing. I very rarely have these ticked. Usually if I have these things ticked, it's because I'm using a custom database that I've made, or a custom league that I've made. It's the only time that I would add key staff to a team as well, or add players to playable teams, just because 9 times out of 10 when you create a league like that, there's going to be gaps within those teams that you bring in. Finally, on these advanced options, the last thing that I'd like to bring people's attention to is the wording. So you can see it says do not add key staff. So if you tick that box, it will not add key staff. It says disable player attribute masking. If you have a tick in that box, you will be able to see every attribute. If you leave that disable player attribute masking unticked, you will not be able to see player attributes without scouting. It's just worth bearing that in mind. So that's a basic overview, really basic overview of how you're going to set up a new game. And by playing with these options, the mode of the league, playable or view only, by choosing to customize your database and to bring in extra players from across the world, whether that's using current international players or players from continental competitions, you can have much more control over the amount of players in the game and the game speed. So you can see we're now up to 43,000, which is larger than the large database we had originally. We're using a small database with extra players loaded, and our game speed is higher than it was for that large database. So actually the game will run for us slower on a large database than it will on a small database that's been customized and edited to give us more players than that original large database does. So you really do have a lot of control over the game's performance on this screen, as well as the amount of players that the game has available for you to sign and to play with in its processing, okay? So the last thing that I want to talk about here is this little button in the bottom left that says Game Setup. And you can see that it gives us 3 different options: load, save as, and recent. So what I would say is once you have a setup on this screen that you like, and you think, I like the way that looks, I like that I've got 43,000 players on a small database, I like that the game speed is sort of 3.5, 4 stars, I think I'm going to set up a few games using this particular sort of calibration that I've got here. So what we can actually do there is we can save, I've gone to load. We can save this setup so that in the future all we need to do is load it and it will bring up all of these choices we've got, which can make starting a new game much easier. Now you can see here I've got quite a few here. I've got an all-international and top division by country database. That's got 100,000 players. There is an international and top division by continent. That's got 104,000 players. I've got a League 2 database, which is League 2s from across Europe. And you can see that there's quite a lot of things there. This one is really interesting. Road to the European final. It won't let me select it, but that database there actually has 480,000 players. It's almost the maximum amount of players within Football Manager itself. I'm not going to load it because it takes forever to load and it runs really slowly. Oh no, I've just saved over it. So the other thing that we can do here is we can go into the rules page of a competition. So say that we're playing in the Finnish Premier League, for example. We can go into the rules page of that competition and we can see that at the bottom of the rules page there are going to be exceptions. So for example, in Finland, most of the world is considered EU. So what we could then do is we could come into the world section at the top of the screen where we see the little globe and the binoculars. If you click on that, we can look through the options in there and we can actually find a list of all of the countries that are involved in any of the agreements that you see, like the Caribbean Agreement or the EU nations or anything like that. And if we take a little bit of time to write down what those nations are, we can start a save somewhere like Finland or, Belarus or anywhere, and we can then use these extra custom files to load the leagues from every country in the Caribbean Agreement or in some African agreement or the European Free Trade Association, meaning that we then are populating our database with players that we can sign that aren't going to be issues with work permits or any of those sorts of issues. So you can really this screen here has a direct bearing on how difficult or how easy it's going to be for you to scout and sign players contained within the database. And you can set your game up in such a way that it only contains players that you're going to be able to sign, rather than players that you're not going to be able to sign, if that makes sense. There is also here, if I bring this up in Network Idea or Rules, you can see here we've got 83,000 players in this database. If I click on the advanced section, it might take a little bit of time to load. What we will see is that every country that counts as being homegrown or not foreign, for Finland, Denmark and the Netherlands, is selected here in this database. So we have all the nations from the Caribbean agreements, we have all the nations from the EU free trade agreements, we have also selected all of the players from any of the countries that are considered homegrown. So for example, in Belarus, any players from Kazakhstan, any players from Ukraine or Russia, they're considered to be homegrown. So we've loaded those into this database. And what we've done here is we've taken, if I scroll up to the top, we've taken a small database, again, and we've pulled 83,520 players from that small database, with the majority of those players coming from areas which we know we can make signings from owing to the league rules of the leagues we have selected. So that's just a quick overview of the power that this screen gives you. I don't think a lot of people really dive into the game setup in the way that they can, and it can have a profound impact on how long that save file lasts, how quickly that save file runs, and exactly how much ability you have to scout for players and sign players that maybe you've never heard of before or you've never seen before. So I just wanted to run through that. If you like this, let me know. I've never made a video before and it's probably really bad, but the information is solid. Thank you very much.